A homeless black man rescues a lost child in the park, and he is surprised when the child's parents ask him a life-changing question. The park buzzed with the sounds of weekend life, children's laughter, dogs barking, and the faint strum of a street musician's guitar. Sarah Brooks sat on a bench, keeping an eye on her 6-year-old daughter, Emily, as she climbed the jungle gym. David, her husband, sat beside her, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Still can't believe we're here," Sarah said, glancing around at the towering buildings that frame the park. "Everything is so different. It's overwhelming." David nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's definitely a change from the small town," he agreed, "but we'll get used to it. It just takes time." Sarah watched as Emily climbed higher. "I just worry, you know? The city is so big, and so many people." Her voice trailed off, worry creasing her brow. "What if something happens?" David reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her knee. "Emily's fine. She's right there, having the time of her life." He pointed to Emily, who was now hanging from the monkey bars, giggling as another child swung next to her. "We can't hover over her all the time. She needs to explore, to enjoy herself." Sarah tried to smile, but her eyes kept darting back to Emily. "I know, but it's just—" She stopped short as Emily dropped to the ground and took off toward a brightly colored balloon vendor a few yards away. "Emily!" Sarah called out, but her voice was lost in the noise of the park. She stood up, looking over the heads of the crowd. David chuckled softly. "She's just getting a closer look." "I'll go grab her," he said, rising to his feet. But as he took a step forward, a group of joggers passed by, blocking their view for a moment. When they cleared, Emily was gone. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "David, where is she?" Her voice was tight, on the edge of panic. David scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. "She was just—" He turned in a circle, searching the crowd. "Emily!" he shouted, louder now, urgency creeping into his voice. Sarah's breath came in short gasps. She grabbed David's arm, her eyes wide. "David, I don't see her. Where is she?" People around them started to notice, glancing over with concern. David took Sarah's hand, squeezing it tight. "Stay calm. We'll find her. She can't have gone far." They moved through the crowd, calling Emily's name. Sarah's voice was high-pitched, cracking as she shouted, "Emily! Emily, where are you?" They approached the balloon vendor, but Emily wasn't there. David asked a nearby woman if she'd seen a little girl in a pink dress with blonde hair. The woman shook her head, her expression sympathetic. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "Not here. Not now." David put his arm around her shoulders, steering her toward the playground. "We'll find her, Sarah. She's just hiding somewhere, playing a game. Kids do that." His voice was steady, but his eyes were darting back and forth, betraying his own rising panic. They searched the playground, checking behind slides, in the tunnels, and under the benches. There was no sign of Emily. Sarah's hands were trembling. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 with shaky fingers, her voice cracking as she spoke to the operator. "Please, our daughter is missing. She's 6 years old, blonde, wearing a pink dress. We're in Central Park, near the playground by the west entrance." The operator's voice was calm, asking questions, trying to get details. Sarah answered as best she could, her eyes never stopping their frantic scan of the area. David continued to call Emily's name, his voice growing hoarse. Around them, the park seemed to close in, the noise blending into a blur of sound. Faces became a sea of strangers. None of them familiar, none of them Emily. Sarah's chest tightened. It was like being caught in a storm. No clear direction, just chaos. "David," Sarah choked out, "we have to find her. We have to." David took her hand, squeezing it hard. "We will," he said, his jaw set. "We'll find her, Sarah. I promise." They continued their search, voices strained with desperation, pushing through the crowd. Around them, the city carried on, oblivious to their fear, as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Frank Thompson sat on the cold concrete near the subway station entrance, his back resting against the rough brick wall. His eyes watched the blur of feet passing by, high heels, scuffed sneakers, polished leather shoes. The crowd moved in waves, busy with their own lives, oblivious to him. Frank's fingers fiddled with the edge of his old worn coat, feeling the fabric thinning. A small cardboard sign lay in front of him, the words "Anything helps" scrawled in faded marker. He had been there for hours, maybe more. Time blended together when you had no place to go. A few coins jingled in the cup beside him, dropped by hurried hands without even a glance. Frank didn't mind. He was used to being invisible. A sound caught his ear, small, high-pitched, and out of place among the city's chaos. Crying. Frank looked up, squinting through the crowd. His eyes settled on a little girl standing a few feet away, her tiny shoulders shaking with sobs. She wore a pink dress, her blonde hair tangled and her cheeks wet with tears. People walked past her, stepping around her without noticing. Frank's heart tightened. He knew that feeling too well, the feeling of being lost and alone. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his knees creaking in protest. He walked over to the girl, moving slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he was close enough, he crouched down to her level. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "What's wrong, little one?" The girl looked up, startled. Her blue eyes were wide, full of tears. She took a step back, glancing around as if looking for someone else to help her, but no one stopped. Frank kept his voice gentle. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" She nodded, a small, shaky nod. "I can't find my mommy and daddy," she said in a small voice, almost a whisper. Frank's heart ached at the sound of her voice. "I see," he said. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "My name is Emily." "Emily, that's a pretty name," Frank said, trying to smile. "My name is Frank. I bet your mommy and daddy are looking for you right now. Do you remember where you last saw them?" Emily sniffled, thinking hard. "At the park," she said. "There were balloons, and then I couldn't see them anymore." Frank nodded, understanding. The park wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but it was easy for a small child to get turned around, especially with so many people everywhere. "I'll help you find them," Frank said. "We'll go back to the park, and I bet we'll find them there, okay?" Emily looked at him with a mix of hope and fear. "You will," Frank nodded. "I promise. Let's go." He held out his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Emily took it, her small fingers wrapping around his rough, calloused ones. They started walking, Frank leading Emily through the crowd. He kept glancing down at her, making sure she was okay. Her grip on his hand was tight, but her steps were small and hesitant. Frank tried to think of things to say to keep her calm. "Do you like balloons, Emily?" he asked, looking down at her. Emily nodded. "I saw a blue one," she said, her voice a little steadier now. "It was my favorite color." "Blue's a nice color," Frank said. "I like blue too. It reminds me of the sky. Big and open, like a place you can run in forever." Emily looked up at him, curious. "You like to run?" Frank chuckled softly. "Used to. A long time ago," he said. "Now I just like to watch the sky. It's nice to think about, all that space." They walked past a small convenience store, and Frank paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the few coins he had collected. He knew it wasn't much, but it would be enough. "Are you thirsty?" he asked Emily. She nodded. "A little." Frank led her into the store, the bell above the door ringing as they entered. The cashier glanced up, then back down, uninterested. Frank quickly grabbed a bottle of water and a small bag of chips, handing them to Emily. She took them with both hands, eyes wide. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome," Frank replied, paying the cashier with his coins. He didn't mind the way the cashier avoided looking at him. He was used to it. All that mattered was getting Emily back to her parents. They continued their walk, the park now in sight. Frank could see the balloons in the distance, bright against the green trees. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing Emily's hand gently. "Just a little bit more." Emily looked up at him, a small smile on her face. "Okay," she said. Frank felt a warmth spread in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. He was doing something good, something right, and for the first time in years, he felt like he mattered. Frank and Emily stepped back onto the sidewalk, the noise of the city immediately surrounding them again. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the pavement. Frank kept a firm grip on Emily's hand, guiding her through the crowd. He could feel her tiny fingers holding on tight, her trust giving him a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in a long time. "Do you live near here?" Emily asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Her voice was quiet, but curiosity flickered behind her nervousness. Frank hesitated for a moment before answering. "Not really," he said. "I move around a lot, stay wherever I can. The city's a big place. There's always somewhere to go." Emily's brow furrowed. "But where's your home?" she asked. Frank smiled a little, trying to keep his voice light. "The city is my home, I guess. All the streets and the buildings. I know my way around pretty well. Helps me find what I need." Emily seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded as if she understood. They continued walking, passing storefronts and apartment buildings. Frank kept an eye on the people around them, watching for any signs of Emily's parents. He knew they had to be looking for her, probably worried out of their minds. The thought made him walk a little faster. They came to a crosswalk, the light blinking red. Frank stopped, looking down at Emily. "When the light changes, we'll cross, okay?" he said. "Always wait for the green light." Emily nodded. "My mommy says that too. She says it's safe to cross when the light is green." Frank smiled at that. Your mommy's right. It's important to be safe. They waited, and when the light turned green, Frank led Emily across the street. The park was just a few blocks away now. He could see the tops of the trees, the colorful balloons from the vendors. Emily's steps grew quicker, and she tugged on his hand. There, she said, pointing. That's where I saw the balloons. Mommy and Daddy must be there. Frank nodded, picking up the pace. I bet they are, he said. We'll find them soon. As they got closer to the park, the crowd thickened. Families were out enjoying the late afternoon, children running and playing, dogs barking. Frank steered Emily toward the entrance, his eyes scanning the faces around them. He spotted a few police officers standing near the playground, talking to a couple who looked anxious. Frank felt his chest tighten. This was going to be the hard part. Emily, Frank said gently, stopping and kneeling down to her level. I see some police officers over there. They might be able to help us find your mommy and daddy. How about we go talk to them? Emily hesitated, her grip on Frank's hand tightening. Will they be mad at you? She asked, her voice small. Frank's heart ached at the question. No, sweetheart, he said softly. They just want to help you, like I do. We're all just trying to get you back to your family. Emily looked into Frank's eyes for a moment, then nodded. Okay, she said. Frank stood up and took a deep breath. He walked toward the officers, keeping Emily close. As they approached, one of the officers noticed them and stepped forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion. What's going on here? The officer asked, his voice sharp. He looked Frank up and down, taking in his worn clothes and unshaven face. Frank kept his voice calm. This is Emily, he said, nodding toward the little girl holding his hand. She got separated from her parents in the park. I found her near the subway station and brought her back. We're just trying to find her parents. The officer's eyes narrowed. How long have you been with her? He asked, his tone distrustful. Frank glanced at Emily, then back at the officer. Not long, he said. I just wanted to make sure she got back safely. Another officer stepped forward, a woman with a kind face. She crouched down in front of Emily. Hi, sweetie, she said gently. Can you tell me your name? Emily looked at Frank for reassurance, and he nodded. Go on, he said softly. Emily, she said to the officer, I got lost and Frank helped me. The female officer smiled warmly. Well, that was very nice of Frank, wasn't it? She stood up, looking at her colleague. Let's see if we can find your mommy and daddy, okay? Frank felt a small wave of relief wash over him. The female officer was helping to ease the tension. He glanced at the other officer, who still seemed wary, but nodded. Just then, a woman's voice called out from behind them. Emily! Sarah's voice was filled with relief and fear. Emily turned and saw her parents rushing toward her. Mommy, Daddy, she cried, letting go of Frank's hand and running into Sarah's arms. Sarah knelt, holding Emily close, tears streaming down her face. David wrapped his arms around both of them. His eyes closed in relief. Thank God, he murmured. Frank stepped back, feeling suddenly out of place. He watched the reunion from a few steps away, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He knew it was time to go. He had done what he could. But before he could turn to leave, Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his. Are you the one who found her? Sarah asked, her voice shaky but grateful. Frank nodded. She was near the subway, he said quietly. I just brought her back. Sarah stood up, still holding Emily's hand. She walked over to Frank, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. Frank shrugged, feeling awkward under her gaze. Anyone would have done the same, he said, looking down at his feet. David came over, extending his hand. No, not everyone would, he said. Thank you. Really? Frank hesitated, then he shook David's hand. I'm just glad she's safe, he said. He looked at Emily, who was watching him with wide eyes. You take care, Emily. Stick close to your folks, okay? Emily nodded. Okay, she said softly. As Frank turned to leave, Sarah touched his arm. Wait, she said. Do you need anything? A place to stay, maybe? We could help you. Frank paused, surprised by the offer. He looked at Sarah, then at David, who nodded in agreement. We'd like to help you, David added. Frank shook his head slowly. That's kind of you, but I'm okay, he said. Just take care of your little girl. Sarah nodded, though she looked hesitant to let him go. If you ever need anything, she said, her voice trailing off. Frank gave a small smile. Thank you, he said. Then he turned and walked away, blending back into the crowd. As he left the park, he glanced back once to see Emily waving at him, her small hand in the air. Frank waved back, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Frank's steps were heavy as he left the park behind. The weight of the last few hours hung on him, but in a strange way, he felt lighter. He'd helped Emily, reunited her with her parents. It was the right thing to do, yet a part of him felt exposed, vulnerable, as if stepping into the light had brought more attention than he was comfortable with. He usually preferred to stay invisible. As he walked, he noticed the shadows lengthening. He passed a shop window, glancing at his reflection. His coat was old, frayed at the edges, and his beard had grown wild. He knew what he looked like, what people thought when they saw him. He had seen this suspicion in the police officer's eyes. It wasn't the first time, and yet Emily's innocent trust and the gratitude from her parents had momentarily stripped away the armor he had built over the years. Lost in thought, Frank almost didn't notice the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from behind. He turned just as a young man, a volunteer wearing a bright orange vest with the word helper emblazoned across it, rushed toward him, holding a clipboard. "Hey, wait," the young man called out, slightly out of breath. Frank stopped, wary. "Are you the one who found the little girl? The one lost from the park?" Frank nodded cautiously. "Yeah, that was me," he said. The young man smiled, looking relieved. "Great, great. Her parents are looking for you. They want to talk to you. Thank you for helping out." He glanced at Frank's coat, his worn shoes, then quickly looked back up, trying to mask any judgment. They were worried sick. Frank felt a knot form in his stomach. The last thing he wanted was more attention. "I already talked to them," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm just heading on my way now." The young man hesitated. "Well, they were really grateful. And, the police just want to ask a few questions, make sure everything's okay." He paused. "They might want to know more about you, where you're from, that kind of thing." Frank's eyes darkened. He knew where this was heading. "I told them everything they needed to know," he said flatly. "I found the girl, brought her back. That's it. Nothing else to tell." The young man nodded, a little unsure of himself now. "Right, okay. It's just protocol, you know? You seem like a good guy, just wanting to help, but you know how it is." Frank knew exactly how it was. He felt the old instinct to fade back into the shadows, to disappear before things got complicated. "I do know how it is," Frank said, his voice low. "Thanks for checking in, but I'll be on my way." Before the young man could respond, Frank turned and walked quickly down the street, blending into the flow of people. He kept his head down, moving with purpose, as if he had somewhere important to be. He knew how to disappear in the city. The streets and alleyways were like a maze he had memorized. He slipped into a narrow alley, the noise of the main street fading behind him. The walls of the buildings on either side provided a sense of safety. He leaned against the cool brick, taking a deep breath. He knew the questions that would come if the police caught up to him. Questions he'd rather not answer. About where he slept, why he was out on the streets, what he did all day. He didn't want pity or suspicion. He just wanted to be left alone. As he stood there, Frank heard a noise at the end of the alley. He turned, his eyes narrowing. It was another police officer, different from the one in the park, a middle-aged man with a serious expression. The officer had a hand on his belt, not reaching for his weapon, but close enough to make a point. "Sir, can I talk to you for a minute?" the officer called out, his voice authoritative but not unkind. Frank sighed. He had been found again. He stepped away from the wall, standing still, showing he wasn't a threat. "What is it?" he asked. The officer approached, his eyes assessing Frank carefully. "We got a call about a missing child," he said. "You brought her back to the park, right?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, I found her near the subway. She was lost. I just wanted to help her find her parents." The officer's eyes didn't leave Frank's face. "That's a good thing you did," he said. "But I need to know a little more. Where were you before you found her? Did you see anyone else with her?" Frank kept his voice calm, meeting the officer's gaze. "No one else was around, just her, standing there crying. I don't know what else you want me to say." The officer glanced at the buildings surrounding them, then back at Frank. "Look, I'm just trying to make sure everything checks out. We've had incidents before, people taking advantage of situations like this." Frank's jaw tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "I just wanted to help." The officer watched him for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I believe you, but you understand we have to ask. It's our job to protect people, especially kids." Frank nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing a little. "I get it," he said. "I've got nothing to hide." The officer seemed to soften. "If you need anything, any help, a place to go, we have resources, shelters, places to get food. You don't have to be out here." Frank nodded, though he knew he wouldn't take the offer. "Thanks," he said quietly. The officer gave him a final nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Frank alone in the alley. Frank waited until the officer's footsteps faded, then slowly made his way back to the main street. He blended into the crowd again, feeling the familiar anonymity wash over him. The encounter had shaken him, but he was used to being questioned, doubted. As he walked, he thought about Emily, her small hand in his, her trust. For a moment, she had seen him not as a homeless man, but as a friend. And her parents, despite their initial hesitation, had thanked him. That meant something. Maybe not enough to change his life, but enough to remind him that he could still do good, still make a difference, no matter how small. He found a quiet spot in a small park at the edge of the city, away from the crowds and noise. He sat down on a bench, leaning back, feeling the evening breeze on his face. He closed his eyes, letting the tension drain from his body. In a world that often turned its back on him, he had found a moment of connection, a fleeting glimpse of what it meant to be seen, to be needed. And for now, that was enough. Frank sat on the bench in the small park, his eyes closed, trying to push away the thoughts that were crowding his mind. He was used to moving through life like a shadow, avoiding attention. Today had been different. He had stepped into the light, if only for a moment, and now he was feeling the weight of it. But he couldn't shake the image of Emily, her trusting eyes looking up at him, her tiny hand gripping his. He had done something good today, and that thought brought a warmth to his chest. He opened his eyes, staring at the sky as it began to change color, the sun setting behind the buildings. The park was quiet, the sound of the city just a distant hum. Frank wondered if Emily and her parents were home now, safe and together. He hoped they were. A rustle of footsteps on the path pulled Frank from his thoughts. He glanced over and saw a familiar face. Sarah, Emily's mother, walking towards him. Her eyes were searching, and when they met his, she gave a small smile, relief washing over her features. Frank sat up straighter, surprised to see her here. "Frank?" Sarah called softly, as if she was afraid to startle him. "Yeah, it's me," Frank replied, getting to his feet. He noticed David a few steps behind her, holding Emily's hand. Emily was skipping slightly, her blonde hair bouncing. Seeing them all together brought a sense of closure, a confirmation that everything had turned out okay. Sarah approached Frank, her smile widening. "We've been looking for you," she said. "After we left the park, we couldn't stop thinking about what you did for us. We wanted to thank you properly." Frank shifted on his feet, feeling a little embarrassed. "You already thanked me," he said. "I was just doing what anyone would do." David stepped forward, extending his hand again. "No, Frank, not everyone would have done what you did. You went out of your way to help our daughter, a stranger. That means a lot to us, more than words can say." Frank hesitated, then took David's hand, shaking it firmly. "I'm glad she's safe," Frank said. "That's all that matters." Emily let go of David's hand and ran up to Frank, her face bright with a smile. "Frank," she said, looking up at him, "guess what? Mommy and Daddy took me to the ice cream shop, and I got my favorite, chocolate with sprinkles. They said it's because you helped find me." Frank chuckled, his rough features softening. "That sounds delicious," he said. "I'm glad you got a treat." Sarah looked at Frank, her expression serious now. "Frank, we know you've been living on the streets," she said gently. "We've been talking, and we want to help you. You did something kind for us, and we want to return the favor." Frank shifted his gaze to the ground, uncomfortable. "I appreciate that, but I've been getting by," he said. "You don't need to worry about me." David shook his head. "It's not about worrying, Frank. It's about doing what's right. You deserve a chance, just like anyone else. We can help you find a place to stay, maybe even a me. I know people who could use someone reliable." Frank felt a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him more than a passing glance. He looked at Emily, who was still smiling up at him, and then back at Sarah and David. Their faces were open, genuine. They weren't looking at him with pity or judgment, just kindness. "Why would you do that?" Frank asked, his voice low. "Why help me?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft. "Because you helped us. You helped our daughter. And because everyone deserves a chance to have a better life. You gave us back our little girl. The least we can do is try to give something back to you." Frank took a deep breath, his emotions a mix of gratitude and fear. He had learned not to trust too easily, but something about this family made him want to believe. He glanced at Emily, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "I don't know," Frank said quietly. "It's been a long time since anyone cared." David placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Well, we care, and we want to help, if you'll let us." Frank looked at them, seeing nothing but sincerity. Slowly he nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll give it a try." Emily clapped her hands, her face lighting up. "Yay! Frank's going to be our friend." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining. "Yes, Emily, Frank's our friend, and friends help each other." They stood there for a moment, the four of them, the city's noise fading into the background. Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of a different future, one that wasn't just about surviving day to day. "Thank you," Frank said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Sarah squeezed his arm. "It's us who should be thanking you, Frank. for finding Emily, and for reminding us that there's still good in the world. David nodded. Come on, let's get you something to eat. We'll talk about the next steps. They started walking together, Emily holding Frank's hand. Frank felt the warmth of her tiny fingers in his, the hope in her touch. He glanced up at the scenery, which was now a deep orange with the setting sun. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he was walking towards something, not away. As they left the park and headed back into the heart of the city, Frank knew this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that held promise and possibility. And as he walked beside this family, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he belonged. Frank sat at the small dining table in Sarah and David's kitchen, feeling the warmth of the home around him. The room was bright and cozy, with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of a faint radio playing in the background. It had been a few days since they had found him in the park, and true to their word, Sarah and David had taken him in, giving him a chance to rest and eat. Frank wasn't used to this kind of kindness, the kindness that expected nothing in return. More soup, Frank? Sarah asked from the stove, her voice cheerful. She was holding a ladle, ready to fill his bowl again. Frank looked at his empty bowl, then up at Sarah. He nodded, managing a small smile. Yes, please, he said. It's really good. Sarah smiled back as she poured another serving of the steaming soup into his bowl. I'm glad you like it. It's my mom's recipe. I used to make it all the time when Emily was a baby. It's the ultimate comfort food. Frank nodded, feeling a warmth that wasn't just from the soup. He had spent years without a place to call his own, moving from street to street, bench to bench. Now, sitting in this kitchen with the sounds of a family around him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. David entered the kitchen, carrying a folder. He sat down at the table next to Frank, spreading out some papers. I made a few calls, David said, his voice steady. I have a friend who manages a maintenance company. They're always looking for reliable people. He said he could get you started on Monday if you're interested. Frank looked at the papers, his heart pounding. Maintenance, he asked, like fixing things? David nodded. Yes, stuff like that. Cleaning, making sure everything is in order. They provide training, so you don't need to worry if you don't know everything right away. Frank swallowed, overwhelmed by the offer. I haven't worked in years, he said quietly. I don't know if I can do it. David leaned forward, his voice kind but firm. You've been surviving out there on your own. That takes a lot of strength, Frank. I think you can handle this. And if it doesn't work out, we'll find something else. You don't have to do this alone. Frank felt the sincerity in David's words, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe that maybe he could do it. Maybe this was his chance to start over. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with encouragement in her eyes. I'll try, Frank said finally, his voice filled with determination. I'll give it my best. Sarah smiled. That's all anyone can ask, she said. One step at a time. Frank nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying until now. He sipped his soup, letting the warmth spread through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose, a direction. Emily ran to the kitchen, holding a drawing in her hand. Look what I made, she exclaimed, waving the paper. She ran up to Frank, her eyes shining. It's for you, Frank. Frank took the drawing, his rough fingers handling the paper gently. It was a picture of him, standing next to Emily in the park, both of them smiling. Around them, bright balloons floated in the air. Frank felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the picture. Thank you, Emily, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's beautiful. Emily beamed. Mommy says you're going to stay with us for a while, she said. Is that true? Frank glanced at Sarah and David, then back at Emily. Yes, he said softly. I think it is. Emily clapped her hands. Yay! Now we can play together all the time. Frank smiled, feeling a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. He looked at David, who was watching him with a satisfied expression, and Sarah, who nodded with approval. They were offering him more than just a roof over his head. They were offering him a chance to be part of a family, to be part of something bigger than himself. After dinner, Frank helped Sarah clear the table while David tucked Emily into bed. It felt natural, as if he had been doing this for years. As they worked, Sarah spoke softly. Frank, we've been talking, she said. David and I, we think you should stay here, at least until you get back on your feet. There's no rush. We want you to feel at home. Frank paused, a dish in his hand. He looked at Sarah, her face open and kind. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. You don't even know me. Sarah put a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. Because you helped our daughter, she said. And because everyone deserves a chance. You've been through a lot, and we just want to help. Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. He turned away, not wanting Sarah to see. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick. You don't have to, Sarah said softly. Just be here. That's thanks enough. Later that night, Frank lay on the small cot they had set up for him in the spare room. The house was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft murmur of voices from Emily's room. Frank stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a mix of fear and hope. He had lived so long with nothing, expecting nothing, that the idea of having a place, a room, and people who cared about him felt almost too much to believe. But as he closed his eyes, he let the warmth of the house wrap around him, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe he could start over, one step at a time. And with Sarah, David, and Emily by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to do it alone. Frank drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, feeling for the first time in a long time that tomorrow was something to look forward to, not just another day to get through. Several weeks had passed since Frank had moved in with Sarah, David, and Emily. The days had started to fall into a comfortable routine, a rhythm that Frank had almost forgotten existed. Each morning he would get up early, before the rest of the house stirred, and sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the city. The simple act of having a place to sit, a hot drink in his hands, felt like a gift. On this particular morning, Frank sat on the porch steps, sipping his coffee. The air was cool and crisp, a reminder that fall was approaching. He could hear the faint sounds of the city waking up, car engines starting, the distant hum of traffic, birds chirping in the trees. Frank took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment settle over him. He was still getting used to the idea of having a job. David's friend had come through and Frank had started working at the maintenance company. It was hard work, cleaning offices, fixing leaky faucets, and keeping the building in order. But it was honest work. And every day Frank felt a little more like he was finding his place in the world again. He liked the routine, the sense of purpose. And at the end of each week, when he received his paycheck, he felt a quiet pride that he hadn't felt in years. "Good morning, Frank," Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. She came bounding out of the house, her hair still a mess from sleep, but her face bright with a smile. Frank turned and smiled at her. "Good morning, Emily. You're up early today." Emily nodded, climbing up onto the porch beside him. "Mommy says we're going to the park after breakfast," she said. "Will you come with us?" Frank hesitated. He still felt a little out of place when they went out together, like he didn't quite belong. But Emily's eyes were shining with excitement, and he couldn't say no to her. "Sure, I'll come," he said. "That sounds nice." Emily grinned and hugged him quickly before running back inside to tell her parents. Frank watched her go, feeling the warmth of her hug lingering. He finished his coffee and stood up, ready to face the day. Later that morning, they all walked to the park together. Emily skipped ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased after a butterfly. Sarah and David walked side by side, talking quietly, their faces relaxed. Frank walked a few steps behind, taking it all in. The park was alive with families, children playing, and people walking their dogs. It was a perfect day, the sun shining, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. They found a spot under a large oak tree and spread out a blanket. Emily immediately ran to the playground, climbing up the slide and waving at them from the top. Frank sat down on the blanket, feeling the sun on his face. Sarah handed him a sandwich, and he took it gratefully. "You've been doing really well, Frank," Sarah said, sitting down beside him. "David says you're doing a great job at work. We're really proud of you." Frank nodded, swallowing a bite of his sandwich. "Thank you," he said. "It feels good to work again, to have a purpose. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Sarah smiled. "We're just glad you're here," she said. "You're part of our family now." Frank felt a lump in his throat. Family. It was a word he hadn't thought about in a long time. He looked over at David, who was watching Emily play, a proud smile on his face. This was what family felt like, he realized. Caring about each other, being there for one another. He hadn't known how much he missed it until now. "Frank," David said, turning to him, "we've been talking, and we want you to stay with us. Not just until you get back on your feet, but for as long as you need. You've become important to us, to Emily, and we don't want you to go." Frank looked between Sarah and David, their faces earnest and sincere. His heart swelled with emotion. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick. "I never expected this. You've given me more than I could ever repay." David shook his head. "You don't owe us anything, Frank. We're just glad you're part of our lives. And if there's anything you need, ever, we're here for you." Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. He blinked them away, nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'd like to stay." Emily came running back, her face flushed with excitement. "Look, Frank," she said, holding out a small flower she had picked. "This is for you." Frank took the flower, a small daisy, and smiled. "It's beautiful, Emily. Thank you." Emily sat down beside him, leaning against his arm. "I'm glad you're staying with us," she said simply. "You're the best." Frank wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of her trust. "I'm glad too, Emily. he said softly. As the afternoon turned to evening, they packed up their things and started walking back home. Emily held Frank's hand, skipping beside him, talking about all the things they would do together. Frank listened, feeling a smile spread across his face. And in that moment, with Emily's hand in his and Sarah and David walking beside him, Frank knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.